They called him the Ghost of the Bitterroots, a man who wore rags and smelled of pine resin and old leather. The town of Bannock, Montana, laughed when Lydia Sterling, a destitute seamstress with nothing left to lose, took his calloused hand in marriage in the winter of 1885. They whispered that she'd be dead by spring, frozen in some leaky shack on the peaks. But they were wrong. They didn't know who Silas Thorne really was, or the empire he had built in the clouds. What started as a desperate act of survival became a love story that would rewrite the history of the American West. This is the legend of the poor mountain man and the hidden fortune that changed everything. The year was 1885, and the wind cutting through the cracks of the Bannock boarding house felt less like weather and more like a judgment. Lydia Sterling sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her fingers raw from needlework that no longer paid the bills. The silver mines were drying up, and with them, the need for fine lace and mended waistcoats. At 23, Lydia was considered an old maid by frontier standards, and now, with her father's sudden death leaving her with nothing but gambling debts, she was a destitute one too. The landlord, a greasy man named Mr. Abernathy, had given her until sundown. "Pay up or get out, Miss Sterling," he had sneered, chewing on a toothpick. "The streets aren't kind to women alone." Lydia knew what that meant. In a lawless territory, a woman without protection was prey. She had one option left, a humiliating tradition that still lingered in the desperate corners of the West, the town social and matchmaking auction. It wasn't slavery, not legally, but it felt dangerously close. Men looking for wives, or housekeepers they could call wives, would bid on the dowries or the debts of women looking for security. The town hall was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and wet wool. Lydia stood on the low platform, her chin held high, though her knees shook beneath her skirts. She refused to look at the crowd. She knew the faces: drunk miners, desperate farmers, and drifters looking for a warm body. "Lydia Sterling," the mayor announced, his voice booming but void of pity. "Excellent seamstress, literate, comes with a debt of $40 to the mercantile and $50 to the landlord, who will cover the debt for the lady's hand." Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. $90 was a fortune to most men in Bannock. "She's too skinny," a heckler shouted from the back. "Wouldn't survive a winter." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. She was going to be thrown onto the street. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall groaned open. A gust of snow swirled in, silencing the room. A figure stepped out of the white squall. He was a giant of a man, clad in layers of bear fur and buckskin that had seen better decades. A massive beard, streaked with early grey, hid most of his face, save for eyes that burned like cold blue ice. "The ghost," someone whispered fearfully. It was Silas. No last name known, just Silas. He lived high in the Bitterroot Mountains, coming down only twice a year to trade furs for ammunition and flour. He was rumoured to be mute, or mad, or both. The giant walked forward, the crowd parting like water. He stopped in front of the platform, looking up at Lydia. He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He just studied her, like one might study a deer in a rifle scope. He reached into a pouch at his belt and slammed a heavy leather bag onto the mayor's table. The sound of gold coins clinking against wood echoed like a gunshot. "Full debt," Silas rumbled. His voice was gravel grinding on stone, unused and deep, and 10 more for the ring. The mayor's jaw dropped. He opened the bag, his eyes widening at the glint of raw gold dust and nuggets. "Sold," the mayor stammered, banging his gavel before anyone could object. "To Silas, the mountain man." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. She had prayed for a savior. Instead, she had been bought by a savage. As Silas turned to her, extending a hand the size of a shovel, Lydia hesitated. But she looked at Mr. Abernathy in the front row, grinning maliciously. She looked at the snow outside. She took Silas's hand. It was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. "Pack," Silas said. One word. It was the only instruction she would get. By the time they left the hall, the town was buzzing. "He's taken her to his cave to eat her," one woman hissed. "She won't last a week," said another. Lydia climbed onto the buckboard of his wagon, clutching her small carpet bag, everything she owned in the world. Silas didn't help her up. He expected her to be strong. He snapped the reins over a team of mules that looked as mean and scarred as he did. As the wagon lurched forward, leaving the lights of Bannock behind for the crushing darkness of the wilderness, Lydia realized she hadn't just married a poor man. She had married a mystery. And in 1885, mysteries often ended in shallow graves. The journey up the mountain was a 3-day purgatory. They spoke less than 10 words the entire time. Silas was a man of absolute, terrifying silence. He drove the mules with a focus that bordered on obsession, guiding the wagon up trails that were little more than goat paths. To Lydia's left was a sheer drop of 1,000 feet. To her right, walls of granite that wept ice. The higher they climbed, the colder it got. The air grew thin, making Lydia's chest ache. She wrapped her thin city coat tighter around herself, shivering violently. On the second night, they camped on a ridge exposed to the wind. Silas built a fire with practiced efficiency. He roasted a rabbit he had snared earlier, tearing a leg off and handing it to her. "Eat," he commanded. "Thank you," Lydia whispered, her teeth chattering. She ate ravenously. When she finished, she looked at him across the fire. "Where are we going, Silas? How far is home?" He looked up from whittling a stick. The firelight danced in those intense blue eyes. For a second, she thought she saw something flicker there. Regret? Sadness? But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Hi," was all he said. "Is it a cabin?" she pressed, desperation making her bold. "Is there a stove? A roof?" He stopped whittling. He stared at her for a long moment. "It's safe. That's all you need to know." Lydia fell silent. She slept that night curled under a buffalo robe he threw at her, listening to the howl of wolves that sounded uncomfortably close. She dreamed of her father, of the life she used to have before the debts, before the poverty. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the wagon finally crested the final peak. They entered a dense forest of ancient pines, the trees so thick they blocked out the sun. The snow here was deep, pristine white. "We walk from here," Silas said, pulling the mules to a halt. "Walk?" Lydia looked at her worn boots. "Silas, I can't walking in this snow." "Mules can't make the bridge," he said, jumping down. He began unhitching the animals. "If you want to live, you walk." Lydia stumbled after him, trudging through knee-deep drifts. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed. She hated him then. She hated his strength, his silence, his cruelty. She was convinced he had brought her out here to work her until she died, a beast of burden cheaper than a mule. After an hour of hiking, they reached a narrow gorge. Spanning it was a terrifying rope bridge, swaying violently in the wind. "Cross," Silas said, pointing. Lydia looked down. The river below was a ribbon of white foam, crashing against jagged rocks. "I can't." Silas sighed, a sound like a collapsing mine shaft. He stepped closer, and for the first time he touched her face. His thumb brushed a snowflake from her cheek. "Lydia, look at me." She looked up, startled by the use of her name. "I did not buy you to kill you," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Trust the rope. Trust me." It was the most he had spoken. Trembling, she stepped onto the bridge. The wind whipped her skirts, threatening to toss her into the abyss. She gripped the ropes until her knuckles turned white, inching forward. Silas followed right behind her, his massive bulk shielding her from the worst of the gale. When her feet touched solid ground on the other side, she collapsed into the snow, sobbing with relief. "Get up," Silas said, though his tone was softer now. "Look." Lydia wiped her eyes and stood. She expected to see a shack, a lean-to, a cave. Instead, she saw a wall of rock. Just a dead end. "There's nothing here," she cried, her voice cracking. "You're mad! There's nothing here!" Silas walked past her to the rock face. He reached behind a thick curtain of ivy that was frozen solid. He pulled a lever hidden in the stone, a mechanism of gears and iron that groaned with the weight of ages. With a deep, grinding rumble, a section of the cliff face, cleverly disguised with rock and timber, began to swing inward. It wasn't a cave, it was a gate. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne," Silas said. As the heavy stone door swung wide, Lydia gasped. Inside was not a dark tunnel, but a manicured courtyard illuminated by gas lamps that flickered against the twilight. Beyond the courtyard, built directly into the side of the mountain like a fortress, stood a structure of stone and glass that defied logic. It was a mansion. A sprawling, 3-story estate with stained glass windows glowing with warmth. It was impossible. It was beautiful. Lydia turned to Silas, her mouth agape. The ragged mountain man was gone. In his posture, there was suddenly a pride, a nobility that the rags couldn't hide. "What is this?" she whispered. "Who are you?" Silas walked past her, toward the warmth of the hidden sanctuary. "I am the man the world forgot, Lydia. And this is where we change history." Lydia stood in the center of the grand foyer, her boots dripping melted snow onto a Persian rug that likely cost more than the entire town of Bannock. The air inside the mansion was warm, circulating through brass vents in the floor, a technology she had never seen before. The walls were lined with books, thousands of them, stretching up to a coffered ceiling painted with constellations. Silas closed the heavy iron mechanism of the door, locking the world out. He turned to her, and for the first time, he looked out of place. In the boarding house, he was a monster in a monster's world. Here, amidst mahogany and velvet, his bearskin rags and matted beard made him look like a bear that had wandered into a palace. "The guest room is to the right," Silas said, his voice echoing in the vast hall. "There is hot water in the pipes, soap, clean clothes in the wardrobe. They belong to my mother." "Your mother?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. "Silas, you have to explain. You bought me for $90. You live in a hole in the wall that opens into... this. Who are you?" Silas looked at his hands, scarred and dirty. "I told you, I am a ghost. Go wash, Lydia. Dinner is at 8. He turned and walked toward a heavy oak door on the far side of the hall, leaving her alone in the silence of the impossible house. Lydia found the room. It was exquisite, decorated in French silk, and true to his word, the copper tub in the adjoining room filled with steaming water when she turned a brass tap. It was magic, engineering magic. As she scrubbed the grime of the trail from her skin, the fear began to recede, replaced by a burning curiosity. She dressed in a gown of deep blue velvet she found in the wardrobe. It was slightly old-fashioned, perhaps from the 1860s, but the silk was heavy and expensive. When she looked in the mirror, the destitute seamstress was gone. A lady stared back. At 8 o'clock, she entered the dining room. A long table was set for 2. The only light came from a massive fireplace and silver candelabras. A man stood by the fire. Lydia stopped, her breath catching. Silas had bathed. The bearskins were gone, replaced by a crisp white shirt and a charcoal vest. He had shaved the unruly beard, revealing a strong, square jaw and a face that was younger than she expected. Perhaps mid-30s, though the lines around his eyes spoke of a hard life. He was handsome, in a severe, brooding way. "You look like her," Silas said softly, staring at the dress. "Who?" "My mother. She died here, alone." He pulled out a chair for her. His manners were not those of a mountain man, but of a gentleman. They ate venison, served on fine china. The silence was thick, but Lydia could no longer hold back. "The town says you're a savage," she said, cutting her meat. "They say you rob stages." "The town says what they need to," To make sense of the fear, Silas replied, pouring wine. I don't rob stages, Lydia. I built the stages, or at least the braking systems they use. He took a sip of wine, his blue eyes locking onto hers. My name is Silas Thorne. Does that mean anything to you? Lydia frowned, searching her memory. Thorne. There was a Thorne Engineering in Boston. My father used to talk about the patents. He said they revolutionized steam compression. But the owner died in a fire 10 years ago. Supposedly, Silas said darkly. 10 years ago, I was the most promising engineer on the East Coast. I had patents that would have made mining safer, railroads faster. But I had a partner, a man named Cornelius Rourke. Lydia gasped. Senator Rourke? The Copper King? The very same. Silas spat the name like a curse. He wasn't a senator then, just a greedy investor. He wanted my designs for the new hydraulic pumps. I wouldn't sell the rights. So, one night, my laboratory burned down. They found a body. My assistant. They assumed it was me. I let them believe it. Rourke took the designs, claimed them as his own, and built an empire on my ashes. He gestured to the room around them. I fled west. I found this cavern, a natural fissure, and I built this, a sanctuary. I found gold, veins of it that the prospectors missed because they didn't have the seismic sensors I invented. I mined it alone. I built this alone. I have been waiting, Lydia, watching Rourke grow richer on my stolen life. Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Why me, Silas? Why buy a seamstress from Bannock? Silas set his glass down. The look on his face shifted from anger to something unreadable. Because you aren't just a seamstress, Lydia Sterling. Your father was James Sterling. He was Rourke's accountant for 3 years before he drank himself to death. Lydia froze. You knew my father? I knew he kept a ledger, Silas said, leaning forward. A black ledger. Proof of Rourke's fraud, his bribes, the fire that killed me. Your father tried to blackmail Rourke and got fired. He ran west to hide. I've been watching him for a year, waiting for him to slip up and reveal where the ledger is. Then he died. Silas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. I didn't buy you for a wife, Lydia. I bought you because you are the only person left who might know where James hid that book. If Rourke finds out you're alive, he'll come for you. I bought you to save you, and to destroy him. Lydia pulled her hand away, her heart hammering. She wasn't a bride. She was a tool, a loose end. I don't know where it is, she whispered. He left me nothing but debt. Think, Silas urged, his intensity returning. He must have given you something. A letter? A key? A toy? Nothing, she cried, standing up. He was a drunk. He left me alone. She turned and ran from the room, tears streaming down her face. She fled back to the guest room and locked the door, sliding to the floor in a heap of blue velvet. The mansion wasn't a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage, and she was trapped in the middle of a war between a dead man and a devil. Days turned into weeks. The blizzard outside raged on, burying the mountain in 10 feet of snow, making escape impossible. Inside the mountain, an uneasy truce formed between Lydia and Silas. Lydia spent her days exploring the library. It was a treasure trove of knowledge, physics, chemistry, literature. She realized that Silas wasn't just hiding. He was working. The mansion was a factory. The lower levels, which she discovered by accident, hummed with the sound of dynamos. He had harnessed the underground river to generate electricity, illuminating the mansion with bulbs that burned brighter and longer than anything in New York or London. Silas spent his time in his workshop, a massive cavern filled with prototypes. He was building something, a machine of brass gears and lenses that looked like a cannon. Lydia avoided him, hurt by the revelation of why she was there. But she couldn't ignore the sound of his coughing. At night, through the thin walls, she heard him hacking, a wet, rattling cough that sounded painful. One afternoon she found him slumped over a drafting table, a handkerchief pressed to his mouth. When he pulled it away, it was speckled with red. Consumption? She asked from the doorway, her voice soft. Silas jumped, hastily hiding the cloth. It's the dust. From the mines. Don't lie to me, Silas, she said, walking into the room. She was no longer the timid girl from the auction. My mother died of it. I know the sound. Silas slumped in his chair, looking defeated. It's the lungs, he admitted. Smoke inhalation from the fire 10 years ago. It scarred them. The mountain air helps, but I don't have much time, Lydia. The confession hung in the air, changing everything. He wasn't just a vengeful genius. He was a dying man trying to finish his life's work. Is that what this is? Lydia asked, touching the brass machine. It's a long-range projection lens, Silas explained, his eyes lighting up with the fever of invention. It uses light to transmit Morse code over miles, bouncing off the clouds, wireless telegraphy. If I can finish it, I can send the proof of Rourke's crimes directly to the Washington Post from this mountain. I don't need to leave. I just need the ledger. Lydia looked at him with new eyes. He was fighting a battle he couldn't win without her. I really don't have the book, Silas, she said, her tone gentle now. Papa sold everything. His watch, his wedding ring. She paused. Her hand went to her throat. What is it? Silas asked, seeing her expression shift. The locket, she whispered. He tried to sell it 12 times, but he never did. He said it was the only picture he had of Mama. But the picture was damaged. He glued it in. Silas stood up, swaying slightly. Where is it? I'm wearing it. Lydia unclasped the cheap brass locket from her neck. It was tarnished and dented. Silas took it with trembling hands. He didn't open it. Instead, he carried it to a workbench where a magnifying lens was mounted. He pried the back open with a jeweler's screwdriver. Behind the faded tintype of a smiling woman, folded into a square the size of a stamp, was a piece of onion skin paper. Silas unfolded it with tweezers. It was covered in microscopic handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, bank accounts. This is it, Silas breathed. The account numbers for the shell companies Rourke used to launder the stolen patent money. This is the smoking gun. He looked at Lydia, and for the first time he smiled. A genuine, dazzling smile that took 10 years off his age. You did it. We did it, Lydia corrected him. In that moment, the distance between them vanished. The anger, the transaction, the lies, it all fell away. Silas took a step toward her, and without thinking, Lydia stepped toward him. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. He smelled of cedar and ozone. Thank you, he murmured into her ear. But the moment was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in their world. Boom! A dull thud echoed through the stone walls of the mansion. Then another. Silas pulled back, his face instantly hardening into the mask of the ghost. Explosives. The mines? Lydia asked. No, Silas said, moving to the wall where a series of periscopes were rigged to view the valley below. He looked through one and swore softly. What is it? Pinkertons, Silas growled. They didn't wait for the ledger. Rourke must have gotten impatient. They're blasting the lower pass. They found the bridge. He turned to Lydia, grabbing her shoulders. They know I'm here. And if they're here, they know you're here. How? Because, Silas said, his eyes dark. Mr. Abernathy, your landlord, his name is on this list in the locket. He was Rourke's spy in Bannock. He didn't auction you off to pay your debt, Lydia. He auctioned you to flush me out. He knew I'd come for James Sterling's daughter. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. It was a trap. All of it. We have to leave, Lydia said. No. Silas walked to a gun rack on the wall, pulling down a modified Winchester rifle with a strange cylindrical scope. I can't run. Not with these lungs. And I won't let them take this house. He tossed her a heavy coat. But you are going. There's an escape tunnel in the lower cellar. It comes out 3 miles north. I'm not leaving you, Lydia shouted, surprising herself. You're sick. You'll die. I'm dead already. Silas roared back. "But you have a life to live. Take the paper. Get to the federal marshal in Butte. Go." "No." Lydia grabbed a shotgun from the rack, her hands shaking but her grip firm. She jacked a shell into the chamber, a sound that echoed with finality. "We're partners, remember? You have the high ground. You have the inventions. Let's show them what happens when they come for the ghost of the Bitterroots." Silas stared at her, stunned. Then a fierce pride burned in his eyes. He nodded once. "Check the perimeter," he commanded. "Welcome to the war, Mrs. Thorne." The first shot didn't come from a gun. It came from the mountain itself, as the squad of 12 Pinkerton agents, men in long dusters with hardened faces, crept across the snow-covered bridge. Silas threw a lever in the control room. Outside, a hidden nozzle disguised as a rock formation hissed violently. A jet of superheated steam, pressurized by the mansion's geothermal generator, blasted across the bridge. The lead men screamed, diving backward into the snow to escape the scalding fog. "Stay low!" Silas barked to Lydia. He was moving around the control room with a frenetic energy, checking pressure gauges and pulling switches. The room was the brain of the house, filled with brass speaking tubes and periscopes that allowed them to see every angle of the assault. "They're flanking left," Lydia called out, peering through a brass scope. "Climbing the ice wall. 6 of them." "Let them come," Silas coughed, wiping soot from his forehead. "Activate the Tesla coils on the west perimeter." Lydia hesitated, looking at the strange array of copper wiring Silas had strung along the cliff edge. "The lightning fence?" "Do it!" Lydia pulled the heavy ceramic switch. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, rising to a shriek. Outside, blue arcs of electricity danced between the copper poles. When the climbing grappling hooks of the mercenaries made contact with the wires, sparks showered down like fireworks. The men yelled, dropping their ropes and retreating down the slope, terrified by this magic they couldn't understand. "They think I'm a wizard," Silas grimaced, his face pale. "Fear is a better weapon than lead." But the Pinkertons were professionals, paid by the richest man in America. They adapted quickly. They stopped rushing the house and took cover behind the rocks, opening fire with repeating rifles. Bullets hammered against the stone walls and shattered the beautiful stained glass windows of the upper library. "They're pinning us down," Lydia shouted over the noise of shattering glass. "They're waiting for something." "The cannon," Silas realized, his eyes widening. Rourke wouldn't just send men. He'd send a mountain howitzer. If they set it up on the ridge, "They can blow the front doors off," Lydia finished for him. Silas grabbed his modified Winchester. "I have to stop them before they assemble it. Stay here. Keep the pressure up on the steam vents." "No!" Lydia grabbed his arm. "You can't go out there. You're coughing up blood, Silas. You'll freeze or get shot within 10 yards. If I don't, we die in here. Then use the machine." Lydia pointed to the massive brass device in the center of the room, the wireless telegraph transmitter. "Send the proof now. If we die, let the truth survive." "It's not ready," Silas yelled, frustration warring with despair. "The capacitors need 20 minutes to charge from the hydro turbine. We don't have 20 minutes. Lydia looked at the gauges. The needle was climbing agonizingly slowly. She looked at the periscope. On the ridge, men were assembling the wheel of a cannon. "I can buy us time," Lydia said, her voice oddly calm. Silas stared at her. "What?" "They want me," she said. "Abernathy told them I have the ledger. If I go out there, on the balcony, if I surrender, they'll hold fire. They won't risk destroying the proof." "Absolutely not," Silas roared. "I will not trade you for a few minutes of time." "It's not a trade, Silas. It's a distraction." Lydia grabbed a white tablecloth from a side table. "I go out, I talk, I stall. You charge the gun. When the light turns green, you send the message, and then you open the gate." "Lydia." She didn't wait for his permission. She kissed him, hard, desperate, and full of a love that had bloomed in the snow, and ran for the balcony doors. Silas stood frozen for a second, his heart tearing in two. Then he turned to the machine. He slammed the throttle to maximum. "Charge, damn you," he whispered. On the balcony, the wind was screaming. Lydia stepped out, waving the white cloth. "Cease fire!" a voice bellowed from the ridge. The gunfire sputtered and died. A man stepped forward from the rocks. He wore a fine bowler hat and a heavy fur coat. Captain Sterling, no relation, the head of Rourke's private army. "Mrs. Thorne!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "Smart choice. Throw down the book and we'll let you walk away." "I don't have it on me," Lydia shouted back, her hands trembling so hard she had to grip the railing. "It's inside. I want a deal. I want safe passage for me. And the mountain man. The savage is dead anyway." The captain laughed. "We hang him. You walk. That's the deal." "Then I burn the book," Lydia screamed, holding up a random leather-bound volume of poetry she had grabbed. She held it over the balcony railing, threatening to drop it into the snowstorm below where it would be lost forever. The captain froze. "Don't be a fool, girl." Inside the control room, Silas watched the gauge. 80%. 90%. On the ridge, the men were getting restless. The soldier manning the cannon spun the elevation wheel. The muzzle pointed directly at Lydia. "You have 10 seconds!" the captain yelled. "Wait!" Lydia cried, her eyes darting to the window behind her. She saw a flash of green light. Inside, Silas punched the transmission key. A massive spark leaped from the machine, a crack of thunder that shook the room. The signal, a stream of Morse code detailing every offshore account number, beamed upward, bouncing off the atmospheric ionosphere, hurtling toward the receiving station at the Associated Press in Denver. Done. Silas kicked the door open. "Lydia, get down!" Lydia dropped flat. Silas raised his rifle and fired a single impossible shot. The bullet hit the powder keg sitting next to the cannon on the ridge. The explosion was deafening. The cannon was blown off its wheels, tumbling down the cliffside. The shockwave knocked the Pinkertons flat. Silas ran onto the balcony, scooping Lydia up in his arms. "It's sent," he rasped, grinning like a madman. "The world knows." But his victory was short-lived. A stray bullet from the chaotic return fire struck the stone railing, sending shrapnel flying. A jagged piece of rock slammed into Silas's side, knocking him back. He fell, gasping, blood blooming on his white shirt. "Silas!" Lydia screamed. Silas couldn't breathe. The pain in his side was sharp, but the pain in his lungs was worse. He looked up at the ceiling of his life's work, his vision blurring. "Leave me," he wheezed as Lydia dragged him back inside the control room. "Block the doors, use the tunnel." "Shut up, Silas Thorne," Lydia wept, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his wound, "or you are not dying today." Outside, the Pinkertons, enraged by the loss of their cannon, were advancing. They had abandoned tactics. They were storming the gate with dynamite. Boom! The front doors groaned. Boom! The hinges screamed. Silas grabbed Lydia's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me. The message is out. Rourke is finished. But these men, they can't leave witnesses now. They will burn this place to the ground." He pointed to a red lever under a glass case on the wall. "That controls the hydro turbine's governor. If you pull it, the pressure builds without release. In 5 minutes, the boiler below us explodes. It will bring the mountain down on top of the mansion." Lydia stared at the lever. "You want to destroy it? All of it?" "It's just things, Lydia," Silas whispered, looking at her with infinite tenderness. "The only thing of value in this house is you." The heavy oak doors of the great hall splintered downstairs. Gunfire echoed in the foyer. They were inside. "Help me up," Silas commanded. Supporting his weight, Lydia guided him to a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. It revealed a damp, dark passage cut into the raw rock. "Go," Silas said, leaning against the frame. "I'll stay. I have to pull the lever." "No," Lydia said firmly. She reached past him, smashed the glass with the butt of his rifle, and yanked the red lever down hard. A deep, ominous groaning sound began deep in the earth. The floor vibrated. "We go together," Lydia said, grabbing him again. "Run!" They stumbled into the darkness of the tunnel just as the library doors were kicked open behind them. "They went into the walls," a voice shouted. "Get the dogs!" Lydia and Silas moved as fast as they could. The tunnel was narrow, smelling of mold and wet earth. It wound down deep into the roots of the mountain. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of pursuers. Silas was fading. He stumbled, falling to his knees. "Lydia, I can't." "Yes, you can." "Son." She hauled him up. "Think about Rourke's face when the police arrest him. Think about the look on the Bannock mayor's face when we walk back into town." I never cared about them," Silas gasped. "I only cared about not being alone." "You aren't alone," she sobbed, pulling him forward. The rumbling grew louder. The countdown had started. The pressure in the geothermal pipes was reaching critical mass. They reached a fork in the tunnel. To the left, the sound of rushing water. To the right, darkness. "Left," Silas choked out. "The underground river. It flows out to the valley floor." They scrambled down the rocky slope. The air grew colder, damp with spray. They emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking a subterranean river, black and fast-moving. A small wooden skiff was tied to a rotting post. "Get in," Lydia ordered. She pushed Silas into the boat and untied the rope. As she climbed in, a gunshot rang out. A bullet chipped the rock inches from her head. At the top of the tunnel entrance, the Pinkerton captain stood, silhouetted by the lantern light. He raised his pistol for a killing shot. "End of the line, Mrs. Thorne." Lydia didn't have a gun. She grabbed the only thing she had, the boat's oar, and shoved off the wall with all her might. The current caught the skiff instantly, yanking them into the darkness. The captain fired again, but they were gone, swallowed by the shadows. Seconds later, the world ended. A muffled thump vibrated through the water, followed by a roar that sounded like the earth cracking open. The mansion, thousands of feet above them, was vaporized as the geothermal boiler detonated. The shockwave collapsed the tunnel ceiling behind them. Rocks the size of carriages splashed into the water, creating massive waves that tossed the little boat like a toy. Dust and debris rained down, choking them. Lydia threw herself over Silas, shielding his body with hers, as the mountain collapsed in their wake. They were hurled through the black water, spinning, crashing, and tumbling through the veins of the earth, until the roar of destruction faded into the roar of the rapids. And finally, silence. Lydia woke to the smell of wet ash and the biting grit of glacial mud pressed against her cheek. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It came in jagged, painful fragments. First, the roar of the river, no longer a deafening thunder but a steady, rushing churn. Then, the blinding brightness of the sun reflecting off the snow. Finally, the pain, a deep, bruising ache that settled into her bones, reminding her that she was alive, though barely. She pushed herself up, her arms trembling uncontrollably. Her blue velvet gown, once the symbol of her transformation into the Lady of the Manor, was now a heavy, sodden ruin, shredded at the hem and stained with the mountain's blood. She looked around wildly, her heart hammering against her ribs. They had been spit out by the mountain. The underground river had carried them miles downstream, depositing them on a rocky bank where the water slowed before entering the valley proper. The landscape was serene, indifferent to the catastrophe that had occurred thousands of feet above. "Silas?" Her voice was a cracked whisper, swallowed by the wind. She cleared her throat and tried again, screaming this time. "Silas!" She scrambled over the slick river stones, her boots slipping on the moss. Debris from the explosion drifted past in the lazy current. Splinters of mahogany, a floating velvet chair cushion, a shattered piece of the stained glass window, the wreckage of an empire. Then she saw him. He was lying 20 yards downstream, half submerged in the reeds, his body entangled in a piece of driftwood. He was face down. Lydia didn't remember running, but she was suddenly there, wading into the freezing water. She grabbed the collar of his coat and hauled him onto the bank with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He was heavy, dead weight, his limbs loose and terrifyingly still. "No, no, no!" she chanted, a desperate prayer. She turned him over. His face was grey, his lips blue. The wound in his side, where the rock shrapnel had hit him, was pale and puckered from the water, but the blood had stopped flowing. She pressed her ear to his chest. Silence. "You don't get to do this," she sobbed, pounding on his chest with her fist. "You don't get to be the hero and then leave me. Wake up, Silas Thorne. That is an order." She shook him, water flying from his matted hair. She slapped his cold cheeks, her tears mixing with the river water on his face. The grief was a physical blow, hollowing her out. She had found him in the snow, a beast of a man, and she had discovered the gentle genius underneath. They had won. They had beaten the world. It couldn't end in the mud. "Please," she whispered, collapsing across his chest, her forehead resting on his wet shirt. "Please don't leave me alone." A convulsion racked the body beneath her. Lydia sat back, gasping. Silas arched his back, water erupting from his lungs in a violent, hacking cough. He retched, rolling onto his side, his body heaving as it fought to remember how to breathe. Lydia froze, afraid to touch him, afraid it was a dream. But then he groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure misery. He blinked, his blue eyes glassy and unfocused, staring up at the vast Montana sky. "The boiler," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "It's gone!" Lydia cried, laughing and crying simultaneously as she smoothed the hair back from his forehead. "It's all gone, Silas. The mansion, the tunnel, everything." Silas turned his head slowly to look at her. His gaze clarified, locking onto her face. He didn't look at the debris floating in the river. He didn't look at the smoke plume rising from the distant peak. He only looked at her. "You are heavy," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. Lydia let out a wet, choked laugh. "You idiot! You stubborn, impossible mountain man!" The journey back to Bannock was a purgatory that lasted 2 grueling days. They were stripped of everything. No horses, no weapons, no food, and no money. They were just 2 battered souls limping through the wilderness. Silas leaned heavily on Lydia, his breathing ragged and shallow. The consumption, aggravated by the freezing water and the exertion, had settled deep in his chest. They spent the first night huddled under the shelter of a fallen pine tree, shivering as the temperature plummeted. Lydia built a small fire with dry brush, using the friction method Silas had taught her in the mansion. They sat close, sharing body heat. "I have nothing to give you," Silas said into the darkness, watching the flames. "I brought you into a palace, and I'm taking you back to a slum. I have no gold left, Lydia. It's buried under 1,000,000 tons of granite." Lydia took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his scarred ones. "You have the patents, you have your name, and you have the truth. Rourke can't take those. But I can't build you another castle," he murmured, shame coloring his tone. "I hated that castle," Lydia lied softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "It was lonely. I'd rather have a shack with you than a palace with a ghost." By the afternoon of the second day, the timberline broke, and the town of Bannock came into view. It was a strange sensation, walking down the main thoroughfare. Lydia remembered how she had left, on the back of a buckboard, humiliated, sold like cattle. Now she walked with her head high, supporting the man the town had feared as a monster. They looked like spectres. Lydia's hair was wild and tangled, her dress a rag. Silas was limping, his face gaunt. The noise of the street, the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of the miners, the rattle of wagons, slowly died away as they passed. People stopped in their tracks. A hush fell over Bannock. They stared, but there were no jeers. No one shouted savage or old maid. There was only a heavy, respectful silence. They were looking at them not as outcasts, but as survivors of something they couldn't comprehend. They reached the telegraph office. The door burst open, and the young clerk, a boy named Toby, nearly tripped over his own feet in his haste to get to them. "Mr. Thorne! Miss Lydia!" Toby shouted, waving a piece of paper like a flag of surrender. "We thought... the explosion. We thought the mountain ate you." "It tried," Silas rasped, straightening his spine, summoning the last of his strength to stand tall. "It's all over the wire," Toby stammered, his eyes wide. "The whole territory is talking about it. Look!" He thrust a copy of the Butte Miner into Silas's shaking hands. The ink was still fresh, smudging under his thumbs. The headline, reprinted from the Associated Press, screamed in bold block letters, "The Copper King's fraud exposed. Wireless signal from mountains reveals Rourke's crimes. Silas Thorne lives." Lydia read over his shoulder, her breath catching. "Federal marshals took Senator Cornelius Rourke into custody this morning in Chicago," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "Evidence provided via etheric transmission has led to the immediate freezing of all assets. The Supreme Court has ordered an emergency review of the Thorne patents." Silas lowered the paper. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it for 10 years. The tension that had held his body together, the anger, the vengeance, the paranoia, finally dissolved. The ghost of the Bitterroots died in that moment, leaving only the man. "He's done," Silas whispered. "It's actually over." "And Abernathy?" Lydia asked, her voice hardening as she looked at the clerk. "Where is the landlord?" Toby looked nervous. He saw the news come over the wire this morning. He packed a bag and ran, left the deed to the boarding house on his desk, said he wasn't waiting around for the hangman or for him." He pointed at Silas. Lydia looked across the muddy street to the boarding house. The sign swung on a rusted hinge. It was the place where her life had hit rock bottom, the place where she had been deemed worthless. "We'll take it," Lydia said firmly. She wrapped her arm tighter around Silas's waist. "Mr. Thorne needs a bed, and we need an office." "An office?" the clerk asked. "We have a lot of work to do," Lydia said, a spark of steel in her eyes. "We have to rebuild everything, but this time we're building it in the sun." They never went back up the mountain. Silas said the gold belonged to the earth, and the mansion belonged to the past. Instead, they renovated the boarding house, turning it into the headquarters of Thorne and Sterling Industries. Silas recovered, though the cough never fully left him. His lungs were scarred, a permanent reminder of the fire and the fight. He spent his remaining years not in a dark cave, but on the porch of a sprawling ranch they built on the outskirts of town, always within sight of the peak that had almost killed them. They used the reclaimed fortune not to hoard, but to elevate. They built the first hydroelectric dam in the territory, bringing light to the darkest corners of Montana. They built schools for the miners' children and a hospital where no one was turned away. Lydia became more than a wife. She was the architect of their new life. She managed the empire with a fairness and sharp wit that made her the most respected woman in the West. Years later, in 1910, a reporter from the New York Times traveled all the way to Bannock to interview the reclusive genius Silas Thorne. The reporter was young, eager, and hungry for a story about lost gold. "Mr. Thorne," the reporter asked, his pen hovering over his notebook as they sat in the garden, "you are one of the richest men in America. You changed history with your inventions. But people still talk about the lost gold of the Bitterroots. Do you ever regret leaving it behind? Do you ever regret destroying the greatest mansion the West had ever seen?" Silas was older now, his hair snow-white, his face lined with the map of a hard life. He looked at the reporter, and then he looked towards the garden gate. Lydia was there, cutting roses. She was older too, but she stood tall, her eyes still bright with that fierce intelligence that had saved them on the balcony. She looked up, caught his eye, and smiled. A private, intimate smile that was worth more than any vein of awe. Silas turned back to the reporter. "Son," Silas said softly, his voice rough but warm, "I didn't leave any treasure behind. I brought the only thing that mattered down that mountain with me." He watched Lydia walk toward them, the sun catching the silver in her hair. "My greatest discovery," Silas concluded, "was that a man is only as rich as the woman who stands beside him in the storm." They died 3 days apart in the winter of 1928, during a snowstorm that reminded the town of the legendary winter of '85. They were buried side by side in the valley they had tamed. The tombstones were simple granite, paid for not by their estate, but by the donations of the townspeople they had supported for 40 years. There were no titles, no mentions of millions. Just Silas and Lydia. They walked through the fire and found gold. And that is the incredible legend of Silas and Lydia Thorne. In a time when women were treated like property and men were hardened by the wild, they proved that love is the only currency that really matters. They started with a $90 debt and a desperate gamble and ended up changing the world, not because of the gold they found in the mountain, but because of the strength they found in each other. What do you think? Would you have had the courage to cross that rope bridge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story of justice, romance, and sweet revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know to make more videos like this. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from the Wild West. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next legend.